You have 30 seconds to get out of that seat on your own, or airport security will drag you off this aircraft in front of everyone. Rachel Dunn said it clearly, without heat, the way a person says a thing they have already decided is going to happen. The words carried across the quiet of the first-class cabin and settled over the row like a held breath. Daniel Cole did not argue. He did not raise his voice or ask for a supervisor or reach for the phone in his pocket. He looked at her for a moment, closed his laptop, and gathered his bag. He stood up from seat 2A the same way he had sat down in it, without ceremony, without performance. A man who had learned long ago that stillness said more than noise ever could. 5 minutes later, before the aircraft had even pushed back from the gate, 3 separate calls reached the cockpit in the space of 90 seconds. And every member of that crew went pale. Daniel Cole had figured out somewhere in his 30s that the fastest way to be underestimated was to look like a man who did not need to be taken seriously. He was 39 years old, and he had stopped dressing to be believed. He wore a faded gray hoodie that had lost its shape years ago, dark jeans, and a pair of sneakers that had walked through 3 cities in the last 2 weeks. His backpack was canvas, scuffed at the corners, the kind of bag a man carried when he had stopped caring what a bag communicated about him. He looked like a father heading home from a work trip, and that, in the parts that mattered, was exactly what he was. The gate for Sterling Air Flight 512 to San Francisco was already crowded when he arrived. Departure was set for 10:15 in the morning, and the first boarding call had just gone out over the speakers. Daniel moved through the line without hurry, boarding pass in one hand, the other resting in the front pocket of his hoodie. He had flown enough in his life to know that rushing a process never made it move any faster. His seat was confirmed, 2A, the window in the first row of the first-class cabin. He had booked it 3 weeks earlier, the morning the calendar had finally lined up, because there was one thing on it that he was not going to be late for. His daughter Emma was 8 years old, and that evening, at 7 o'clock in a small auditorium in San Francisco, she was going to sit at a piano in front of an audience for the first time in her life. She had been practicing the same piece for 4 months. He knew this because she had played it for him over video calls, hands too small for the reach, tongue pressed against her lip in concentration, restarting every time she missed a note. Since the divorce, his time with her came in careful, ration pieces, and this was one of them. He had told her he would be in the 3rd row. She had made him promise. He found 2A without help, stowed his backpack in the overhead bin, and settled into the window seat. The cabin was quiet at that hour, the kind of quiet that only lasts until the rest of the plane fills in. He opened his laptop, pulled up a document he had been turning over for the better part of a week, and let the noise of the gate fall away behind him. The lock screen showed a photo of Emma at the piano, mid-laugh, before it dimmed and the document took its place. He was not thinking about the seat or the airline or the flight. He was thinking about a set of numbers on the screen in front of him and about whether he could clear his inbox before the recital so that the evening belonged only to her. Rachel Dunn noticed him the moment she walked the cabin for her pre-boarding sweep. She was the senior flight attendant on this route, and she had spent 9 years learning to read a cabin before it became a problem. It was a skill she was proud of, though she would not have described it in those words. She could tell, she believed, which passengers would need managing and which would not, and she made those assessments quickly. The way experienced people make assessments they have stopped examining. A man in a worn hoodie with a canvas backpack sitting in 2A did not fit the picture her mind had already drawn of the 1st row. Either it was an error in the system, she thought, or it was someone who had gotten a lucky upgrade and had not yet learned how to wear it. She filed the thought away and moved on. But the thought stayed with her, the way a small snag stays in fabric. Marcus Hale, the cabin supervisor, was running the pre-departure checklist at the forward galley when Rachel passed him her read of 2A with nothing more than a look. The two of them had worked enough flights together to speak without speaking. Marcus glanced toward the front row, took in the same picture Rachel had, and returned to his list with his mouth set in a line. Neither of them said anything. They did not think they needed to. It was easier. They had both learned to handle these things early, before the cabin filled and every small adjustment became a scene. Preston Vale came down the jet bridge at 9:51, and the air around him changed before he had said a word. He was in his early 50s, dressed in a way that announced money without appearing to try a jacket that cost more than most people's rent, a watch that caught the light every time he moved his wrist. He was a technology billionaire, a name that appeared on lists, a man who had been photographed enough that he had stopped noticing cameras. He carried himself through the world with the easy, absolute confidence of someone who had not been told no in a very long time, and who had come to experience the word, on the rare occasions it appeared, as a kind of administrative error to be corrected. He had flown Sterling Air often enough to have a favorite seat, 2A, the window in the first row. He liked the light, and he liked being first off the aircraft. And over time, those preferences had hardened into something he experienced as an entitlement. There was one detail Preston Vale was not thinking about as he stepped into the cabin, and it was this: his ticket for Flight 512 was not a first-class ticket at all. His assistant, booking late, had put him in seat 3D in business. Preston had not looked at the seat number. He had never once needed to. He assumed, the way he assumed most things, that the front of the plane would arrange itself around him. He stopped at the entrance to the first-class section, and his eyes went straight to 2A and to the man in the gray hoodie who was looking at a laptop and had not glanced up. He turned to Rachel, who was standing just inside the cabin door, and he did not raise his voice, because men like Preston Vale rarely need to. "There's someone in my seat," he said. Rachel followed his gaze to the first row and felt the small snag in the fabric of her morning pull tight. "Let me take care of that for you, Mr. Vale," she said. It should have ended there. It should have ended with Rachel checking a manifest on "This is the small, unexamined way that these things begin, not with malice, but with a decision made before the facts, and a series of people who choose, one after another, not to look." She moved down the aisle with the practiced efficiency of someone performing a task she considered routine, and she stopped beside 2A. "Sir," she said, in the low, warm register reserved for corrections, "I think there may be some confusion with your seat. Could I see your boarding pass?" Daniel closed the laptop halfway. He reached into the front pocket of his backpack, took out the boarding pass, and handed it to her without a word. She looked at it. The confirmation was clean. "Seat 2A, first class, Flight 512, booked, and paid in full under the name Daniel Cole." She looked at it a beat longer than she needed to, and then she handed it back. "I'm going to check this against our system," she said. "There may be a duplicate assignment." Daniel took the pass back and set it face up on the tray table, where it stayed in view. "There isn't," he said. His voice was even, unhurried. "I booked this 3 weeks ago. The confirmation number's on the pass, if it helps." Rachel did not answer that. She turned and went back toward the galley, and Marcus met her halfway. They kept their voices low, but the forward cabin was small and not yet full, and the ambient noise had not risen to the level that would have covered them. Preston Vale had not sat down. He stood in the aisle 2 rows back with his jacket still on, watching, making no move to find another seat, radiating the particular impatience of a man who expected the problem to resolve itself in his favor as a matter of natural law. Marcus walked up to the row and introduced himself with a smile that stopped at his mouth. "Mr. Cole. I'm Marcus Hale, the cabin supervisor. I'm sorry for the confusion. We've got a situation where one of our premium passengers has a claim on this seat, and I'd like to offer you an alternative in first class, same service, same everything while we sort out the discrepancy in the system." Daniel looked at him the way a man looks at a sentence that does not add up. "There's no discrepancy," he said. My ticket's valid. The seat is mine. If there were a duplicate booking, your system would show which one came first, and mine would. I booked 3 weeks ago. He did not move the boarding pass. I'm staying where I am. Marcus's smile tightened at the edges. He was not used to that answer in this cabin. In his experience, most passengers offered an alternative with enough warmth and enough professional language, took it as a reasonable compromise. But the offer had not landed on Daniel Cole as a compromise. It had landed as exactly what it was, a request that he give up something he had already paid for, to make a stranger more comfortable. Preston stepped forward then and spoke past Daniel to Marcus, as though the man in the seat were a piece of furniture being discussed for removal. I fly this airline more than almost anyone alive, he said. I don't know who this is or how he ended up in my seat, but I am not standing in an aisle while you people figure it out. Daniel did not look at him. He looked at Marcus. He doesn't have this seat, he said. If he did, you'd have shown me the conflict already. You haven't, because there isn't one. Pull the manifest. Run either confirmation number. You'll get the same answer every time. He said it flatly, without aggression. The way a man speaks when he knows he is right and has no interest in dressing it up. That was the moment the situation could still have been saved. It would have taken 2 minutes and a screen. Nobody reached for the screen. 2 rows back, a young woman named Nina Alvarez had stopped scrolling on her phone. She had turned the screen face down against her armrest. Then, after a moment, turned it back up and angled it forward. She was not being obvious. She had seen this shape of thing before, and she understood, instinctively, that what was happening at the front of the cabin looked different through a lens than it did to the eye cleaner. Starker, impossible to argue with. She said nothing. She just made sure the row stayed in frame. Preston was still standing. He raised his voice now, enough that the nearest rows heard it clearly. This is unbelievable. I have people waiting for me in San Francisco. I am not going to be held up by, he gestured at Daniel without looking at him, by someone who clearly doesn't belong in this part of the plane. Daniel heard it. He turned his head and looked at Preston Vale directly for the first time. His expression did not change. I have a boarding pass, a confirmation number, and a paid seat assignment, he said quietly. If you have the same, then it's a system error, and the airline needs to fix it. If you don't, then you don't have a claim. Either way, it takes 2 minutes to check. He turned back toward the window without waiting for a reply. Something crossed Preston's face that suggested he was not accustomed to being answered like that, not with volume, which he could have matched, but with a calm that gave him nothing to push against. He looked at Rachel, then at Marcus, and the look was both an accusation and an instruction. Marcus came back up the aisle with the expression of a man who had made a decision he was not fully comfortable with and intended to carry out anyway. He leaned in and dropped his voice to something meant to feel confidential and firm at once. Mr. Cole, I hear you, and I want you to know we take your booking seriously. But given the circumstances, I need you to move to 3A while we resolve this through the proper channels. We'll have it sorted before we push back. Daniel looked up at him. No, he said. Marcus paused. Sir. No, Daniel said again, without any change in his tone. I'm not moving out of a seat I paid for, so you can decide, later, whether it belongs to me. If the airline made an error, the airline fixes the error. It doesn't ask me to pay for it by sitting somewhere else while a man who's louder than me gets what he wants. He reopened the laptop. I'll be right here when you're ready to check. Marcus straightened. Something in his professionalism had hardened into something colder. He glanced at Rachel, standing just behind him, and gave a small nod. She picked up the internal phone in the galley and made a call. Daniel did not need to hear the words to understand what had just been set in motion. He had spent enough of his life in rooms where people, faced with the choice between admitting they were wrong and escalating, chose to escalate. He knew what came next. He looked at the boarding pass on the tray, then back at the numbers on his screen, and he thought, briefly and precisely, about a third-row seat in an auditorium 3 time zones away, and a promise he had made to an 8-year-old. The meeting he was flying toward would keep. The recital would not. That was the only clock in his head that mattered, and it was running. Outside on the jet bridge, a door opened. Captain James Ford had 21 years in the air, and in that time, he had learned to trust his crew the way he trusted his instruments quickly, and without second-guessing, because hesitation in the wrong moment was its own kind of danger. He was competent, disciplined, and genuinely committed to running a clean operation. What he was not, on this particular morning, was a man with time to stand in the first-class cabin and adjudicate a seat dispute 40 minutes before departure. When Rachel's call reached the cockpit, he listened to her version, asked 2 questions, and made his decision before he had all the facts. That was the mistake. It did not feel like a mistake at the time. It rarely does. He came through the forward galley with the bearing of a man whose uniform still commanded a room when he stepped into one. The cabin went quieter. Marcus stepped aside. Rachel positioned herself near the galley. Preston, who had finally taken a temporary seat, straightened when he saw the captain appear, the way a man straightens when reinforcements arrive. Ford stopped at the first row and looked at the man in the gray hoodie. "Mr. Cole," he said, keeping his voice level. "I'm Captain Ford. I've been briefed on the situation, and I'd like to resolve it before we push back. I'm going to ask you one more time to move to an alternate seat in this cabin while our ground team verifies the booking." Daniel looked up from the screen. He had heard the phrasing before one more time, as though he had already been unreasonable a dozen times. And this was the final courtesy before consequences. "Captain," he said, "I've shown my boarding pass to 2 of your crew. The seat is valid. The confirmation number is on the pass. I've asked them to check it against the manifest in front of me, and they haven't done it. I'm not going to leave a seat I paid for because it's more convenient for the airline to move me than to look at a screen." Ford kept his face steady. "I understand your position," he said, "but I have a responsibility for the safety and comfort of everyone on this aircraft. And right now, this is a disruption. I need you to cooperate." Daniel closed the laptop fully and set it on the empty seat beside him. "Verifying a seat takes less than 2 minutes, he said. "If you open the manifest right now, you'll see my name on 2A with a booking date 3 weeks ago. That's not a disruption, Captain. That's the resolution. The disruption is that nobody on your crew is willing to look." He was not raising his voice. He was not leaning forward. He delivered each sentence the way a man delivers facts plainly, without decoration, without apology. Ford looked at him for a long moment. In 21 years, he had handled a decompression over open water, an engine fire on climb out, and a passenger whose behavior had required federal agents at the gate. A man sitting quietly in his assigned seat, declining to move, was not a safety issue, and somewhere at the back of the captain's mind, something registered that this was not going the way it should. But he had already committed to a course of action in front of his crew, and reversing himself now, in front of a filling cabin, felt like a different and larger problem than the one in front of him. He made the wrong call for a reason that sounded right. It usually does. "Mr. Cole," he said, "I'm the commanding officer of this aircraft, and I'm formally directing you to move to the seat my crew has indicated. If you refuse, I'll have no choice but to involve airport security." Daniel looked at him. "Then involve them," he said, "because I'm not leaving this seat." Nina Alvarez had not lowered her phone. She had adjusted her angle so the front row stayed in frame, and she was not the only one. Across the aisle, another passenger had set a phone flat against an armrest, lens forward. Neither of them said anything. They did not need to. Airport security arrived within 4 minutes. 2 officers in dark uniforms who came down the jet bridge with the practiced neutrality of people who had been called into 100 versions of this and had stopped expecting any of them to be interesting. They listened to Rachel's summary at the galley, nodded, and walked to the first row. The taller of the two addressed Daniel directly. "Sir, the airline has asked that you deplane. We need you to come with us." Daniel gathered his things without argument. He closed the laptop, zipped the backpack, and stood up from 2A with the boarding pass still in his hand. He did not make a scene. He did not appeal to the other passengers or say anything for the cabin to remember. He walked toward the front of the aircraft the same way he had walked onto it, without urgency, without performance, with the quiet self-possession of a man who had already decided how this was going to end and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Preston Vale slid into seat 2A before the jet bridge door had finished closing behind him. The cabin settled. Rachel and Marcus exchanged a glance that said the problem had been handled. Ford went back to the cockpit. The boarding resumed as though the last 20 minutes had been a minor administrative delay, and not a man being removed from a seat he had legally bought, so that a louder man could have it. The other passengers went back to their phones and their headphones, and the particular self-contained silence of people who have witnessed something uncomfortable and decided not to look at it too closely, except for the two who had been recording. Nina Alvarez's video went up at 9:58 in the morning. She posted it with no commentary, just a single line of text. Watched a man get walked off a plane by security so a billionaire could take a seat he already paid for. Sterling Air 512 out of Chicago. His ticket was valid. Draw your own conclusions. The clip ran a little under 2 minutes. It showed Rachel telling Daniel to move. It showed Marcus offering an alternative. It showed Preston Vale gesturing at the man in the hoodie and saying he didn't belong in this part of the plane. It showed the captain's warning. And it showed Daniel Cole standing up, calm, boarding pass in hand, and walking off the aircraft without a word. It did not need to be explained or captioned or contextualized. It was exactly what it looked like. By 10:20, the clip had been shared 8,000 times. By 10:45, it had passed 100,000. Sterling Air's customer service inbox began taking messages faster than the automated system could sort them. The words attaching themselves to the video were not kind, and they were also not wrong. Inside the terminal, Daniel Cole stood at the Sterling Air customer service desk with his boarding pass on the counter and his phone to his ear. He had already made 2 calls. The first was to his assistant, Wei, who was rebooking him onto the next available flight and confirming this was the only part he had asked her to confirm twice, that it would land in time. It would. Barely. The second call was to a number he did not use often. It belonged to a woman named Catherine Shaw, and Catherine Shaw was the chief executive of Meridian Holdings, the company that owned Sterling Air. Here's the thing that none of them knew. Not Rachel, not Marcus, not the captain, not Preston Vale, not Daniel Cole had spent the last 11 years building a company that most people had never heard of, and every airline in the country depended on. It ran the operational backbone of the industry, the systems that handled crew scheduling, manifests, gate assignments, the invisible machinery under every flight. Sterling Air ran on it. And 2 months ago, Meridian Holdings had acquired a controlling interest in that company, in a deal that made Daniel Cole its single largest individual shareholder and gave him a seat on Meridian's board, effective the following week. The man they had walked off Flight 512 for looking like he didn't belong did not merely have a valid ticket. He sat quietly and by every legal measure above the airline that had removed him. He had not planned to use any of that. He had planned to fly to San Francisco, watch his daughter play the piano, and fly home. But he was standing in a terminal because a crew had decided, in the first 30 seconds, who he was. And he had a call to make either way. Catherine Shaw picked up on the second ring. Daniel gave her a plain account of what had happened. He did not editorialize. He told her the flight number, the seat, the names of the crew as he had heard them, and the fact that he was standing in Terminal 2, having been escorted off the aircraft by airport security for declining to give up a seat he had paid for. He said it the way he said everything, without drama, without heat, which somehow made it land harder than shouting would have. Catherine Shaw said very little. When he finished, she said, "Give me 10 minutes." What happened in the next 10 minutes was not visible from the terminal floor, but it moved fast. Catherine Shaw's first call went to Sterling Air's chief operating officer, a woman named Diane Prescott, whose office was on the 11th floor of the airline's headquarters. Diane Prescott had already been forwarded the video by her communications director, who had flagged it 20 minutes earlier as a potential crisis-level event. When Catherine Shaw told her who the man in the gray hoodie was, Diane Prescott's response was immediate and without hedging. She pulled the manifest for Flight 512 herself. Seat 2A, Daniel Cole, booked 22 days ago, paid in full, no flags, no errors, no duplicate assignment. Then she pulled Preston Vale's record, Seat 3D, business class. He had never been assigned 2A, or any first-class seat, at any point. He had walked past his own row, into a cabin he did not have a ticket for, and used his name and his volume to have the airline remove the passenger who did. Nobody at the gate had stopped him. Nobody at the cabin door had checked. Nobody, at any point, in a chain of 4 people whose job it was to check, had looked at a screen. Diane Prescott did not send an email. She picked up the phone and called the gate directly. The aircraft was still there. Departure had slipped while the crew filed a delay report. The gate agent patched her through to the aircraft's internal line. Rachel Dunn answered. What Diane Prescott said on that call was brief and specific. Rachel's expression, visible to Marcus from across the galley, changed in a way that made him set down what he was holding. When Rachel hung up, she turned to look at him, and for the first time all morning, neither of them had anything to say. The call to Captain Ford came separately, straight from the operations center, and it was not a suggestion. By the time he came out of the cockpit, 2 members of Sterling's ground operations team were already walking down the jet bridge. They were not there to help with boarding. The suspension notices were issued digitally. Timestamp 10:41 before the aircraft had pushed back. Rachel Dunn, Marcus Hale, and Captain James Ford each received formal notification of immediate administrative suspension pending investigation, in the kind of language that makes the likely outcome clear to anyone who has read one before. The grounds cited were failure to verify passenger documentation, removal of a ticketed passenger without cause, and conduct inconsistent with the airline's equal treatment policy. Preston Vale was asked to deplane. A gate agent retrieved his bag from the bin above 2A and walked him back up the jet bridge without ceremony. He did not go quietly. But the terminal is a public place, and by that hour there were already people in it who recognized him from the video, and nothing he said on the way out improved his position. At 10:44, Daniel Cole's phone rang. It was Catherine Shaw. We're putting you on the next flight, first class, and someone from the airline is coming to you at the desk right now. She said, I'm sorry this happened. Daniel, I mean that. Daniel listened. He did not tell her it was fine, because it was not fine. I know, he said, and left it there. He picked up his backpack from the counter, put the worn boarding pass into the front pocket, and started back through the terminal toward a different gate. Around him, the airport moved the way airports always move, indifferent, continuous, 1,000 small departures happening at once. He did not look like a man who had just ended 3 careers and set a major airline on fire. He looked like a father who needed to catch a flight and had been made to wait longer than he should have. The next flight to San Francisco departed at 11:30. Daniel Cole was in seat 2A. He did not open his laptop right away. He sat with his bag stowed and his hands on the armrests, looking out the window at the tarmac sliding by beneath the aircraft, and he let the last 2 hours settle into something he could carry without it weighing more than it had to. He did not feel triumphant. That was the part people who had never been through it always got wrong. The idea that being proven right felt like winning. What it actually felt like was tired. He had spent 2 hours holding a position that should never have been challenged, in a place where the rules were written down and available to anyone who cared to look. And he had held it alone while the people with authority made decisions that suited their preferences instead of the facts. Being right had cost him time and composure and the specific low-grade exhaustion that comes not from effort but from staying still under pressure designed to make you move. When the aircraft leveled out above the clouds, he opened the laptop and went back to the document he had been reading when all of it started. But mostly he watched the clock and did the arithmetic and let himself believe he was going to make it. While Daniel was in the air, Sterling Air was burning on the ground. By noon, the video had crossed 400,000 views and was being picked up by news aggregators on both coasts. By 1 o'clock, 2 national outlets had run pieces under headlines that did not require much creativity. A man with a valid first-class ticket had been removed from a plane by airport security so that a billionaire who did not even hold a first-class ticket could take his seat. And the airline's own crew had made it happen without checking a single document. The facts, as laid out by the video and confirmed within hours by Sterling's own records, were not in dispute. That made it worse, not better. There was no alternate reading to offer, no miscommunication to point to, no version of events in which the airline came out looking reasonable. The manifest said what it said, the video showed what it showed. Diane Prescott spent the afternoon in a conference room with the legal team. The communications director, a precise woman named Mara Quinn, and 3 board members who had cleared their schedules the moment the story crossed from social media to the news. The conversation was not about whether the airline had done something wrong. That question had already been answered by the manifest on the video and the suspension notices sent before 11. The conversation was about what came next, how fast it came, and whether the company could get in front of a story that was already moving faster than they could. Mara Quinn laid it out without softening it. Sterling's customer satisfaction had been climbing for 3 straight quarters. A single incident, this visible a paying passenger removed to appease a billionaire, in front of a cabin full of phones, could erase that in a way that took years to rebuild. Advertisers were already sending careful inquiries. 2 corporate accounts had asked their relationship managers for calls. Every hour without a real response was being read online, not as due diligence but as guilt. The board member who spoke first was a man named Arthur Reyes, who had sat on Sterling's board for a decade and had the particular patience of someone who had outlasted several of these moments. "We need to hear from Mr. Cole before we say anything public," he said. "Whatever we release has to be consistent with whatever we agree with him. We cannot get those out of order." No one disagreed. Catherine Shaw had already confirmed the piece of information that unsettled the room. Most Daniel Cole had not engaged a lawyer and had expressed no interest in a financial settlement. A man who was not asking for money in a situation this clean was either planning something larger or operating on principles that made him harder to predict than a number would have been. They would find out which when he landed. Rachel Dunn received her suspension at 10:41 and spent the rest of the day in a controlled disbelief that curdled slowly into dread. She had worked for Sterling for 9 years. She had commendations in her file. She had never had a complaint against her that had not been resolved in her favor. She sat in her apartment that afternoon with her phone face down on the table and tried to build a version of the morning in which she had done the reasonable thing, the professional thing, the thing any senior flight attendant would have done. The problem was the video. She had watched it twice before she made herself stop. It was not a version of events. It was the events. She could see herself in the frame, standing beside 2A with her chin slightly lifted, telling a man who was holding valid documentation to move, as though the documentation were beside the point. She had not opened the manifest in front of him. She had not compared timestamps. She had looked at a boarding pass, confirmed it was real, and then looked at a billionaire in the aisle and made a decision about whose comfort mattered more. What made it hard to watch the second time was not the accusation the video implied. It was that she already knew the accusation was true. She had spent 9 years learning to read people, and the one thing she had failed to read that morning was the cost of a judgment she had made in the first 30 seconds of seeing a man in a gray hoodie in seat 2A. She had decided who he was before she had checked anything. That was where it began. And it was also, she was beginning to understand, where it ended. Captain James Ford did not call anyone. He sat in his car in the airport parking structure for the better part of an hour that evening. Engine off, hands resting on the wheel. He was not a man who made excuses for himself easily. He had committed to a decision without running the check himself, because he had trusted his crew, and because overruling them in front of a full cabin would have felt like undermining them. Those were reasons. They were not justifications. He had known the difference for 21 years, which made it harder to look away from, not easier. He had prided himself on being the last line of accountability on any aircraft he commanded. Today he had been the final authority who ratified someone else's mistake and made it official. When the review came, he intended to say exactly that, not to spread the blame or ask for sympathy, but because it was what the situation required, and he had always believed that what a situation required was what you gave it. It would not save his job. He was not pretending it would. Marcus Hale did not go home that afternoon. He drove instead to a diner near the airport, where the crew sometimes gathered after a shift, and he sat in a booth by the window with a coffee he did not drink, watching the play count on the video climb every time he made the mistake of refreshing it. He had built his career on being the one who kept things smooth, the supervisor, who diffused, who found the compromise, who kept a cabin from becoming a scene. That was how he had described what he did that morning, even to himself, in the first hours after he had been managing a situation. But the video did not show a man managing a situation. It showed a supervisor leaning over a passenger with valid documentation and pressuring him to give up what was his, because the alternative, telling a billionaire no, was the harder conversation. He had chosen the easier one. He had chosen it fast, and without checking, and in front of a cabin full of phones. He understood, sitting in that booth, that the thing he had prided himself on was not a skill at all, if this was where it led. Keeping the peace was not the same as doing the right thing. He had confused the two for years, and it had taken 90 seconds of footage to show him the difference. Prestonvale said nothing that day. His publicist released a short note 3 days later, acknowledging that the situation had been unfortunate and that Mr. Vale had relied on information from airline staff regarding the seating. The note did not include an apology to Daniel Cole, and the absence was noted widely and at length. Reputation is not a structure you repair overnight. It erodes quickly and returns slowly, if it returns at all. 2 conferences quietly removed him from their speaker lists in the weeks that followed. He was, for the first time in a long time, told no by people who had previously only ever told him yes. Sterling's public statement went out at 6 that evening. Mara Quinn wrote it, and Diane Prescott and the board approved it within 40 minutes. It acknowledged, without qualification, that Daniel Cole had been wrongfully removed from his assigned seat, that the airline's own verification procedures had not been followed, and that the crew members involved had been suspended pending review. It stated that Sterling Air held itself to a standard of equal treatment for every passenger, regardless of appearance or status, and that this incident represented a failure of that standard for which the company took full responsibility. It did not reach for softer words. It did not say regrettable where it meant wrong. That counted for something, even if the response online did not at first reflect it. Daniel Cole landed in San Francisco at 1:52 in the afternoon. He did not go to a meeting. He did not return the 24 messages that had arrived while he was in the air. He went to a hotel, showered, changed into a clean shirt, and sat on the edge of the bed for a while with the photo of Emma on his phone. Then he took a car across the city to a small auditorium, and at 10 minutes to 7 he found the third row, and he sat down in it. At 7 o'clock, a girl in a blue dress walked out onto the stage, too small for the piano bench, and looked out into the audience until she found him. He lifted his hand. She smiled and pressed her tongue against her lip in concentration and began to play. She missed a note near the end, the same note she always missed, and she did not stop. She carried through it the way he had told her to, all the way to the last bar. When she finished, he was on his feet before he had decided to be. That was the only part of the day that had ever mattered to him. Everything else had been arithmetic. Daniel met with Diane Prescott and Catherine Shaw 2 days later in a conference room at Sterling's headquarters. He came alone, with no lawyer and no prepared list of demands. He sat down across from them and said what he had come to say in plain language, without preamble. He did not want a settlement. He was not interested in a lawsuit. What he wanted was specific and structural, a public apology, directed at him by name, issued by the airline's chief executive and not by the communications department. A full review and retraining of Sterling's passenger verification procedures, so that no crew member would ever again be in a position to remove a passenger without first running a documented check against the manifest. And a written, published policy establishing that seat assignments were to be honored on the basis of documentation alone, not appearance, not status, not the volume of the person standing in the aisle, and ending permanently any informal practice of letting a passenger's wealth or notoriety override the documented rights of another. Diane Prescott listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she told him the airline agreed to every point. Catherine Shaw, sitting beside her, said nothing during the meeting. But when it ended and the three of them stood, she shook Daniel's hand and held it a moment longer than a handshake requires. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The apology from Sterling's chief executive went out the next morning. It named Daniel Cole. It used the word wrong without qualification, and it did not reach for unfortunate or regrettable or any of the words that public apologies use when they want to express remorse without admitting fault. It said the airline had been wrong, that a passenger had been treated unjustly, and that the people responsible had faced consequences equal to what had happened. The airline announced, the same day, a formal revision to its boarding procedures, documented manifest confirmation required before any seat reassignment, regardless of a passenger's status or tenure. Nina Alvarez, the woman who had filmed it, received a message from Daniel 2 weeks later. It was short. It thanked her for what she had done, and for doing it without being asked. She wrote back 3 sentences that she had not expected the video to travel as far as it did, that she had posted it because it seemed like the kind of thing that should be seen, and that she was glad it had mattered. Daniel read it on a Tuesday morning, at a desk in an unremarkable office, a coffee going cold at his elbow, and a full calendar on the screen. He put the phone down and went back to work. He was, at 39, a man who had learned that the world does not often reward stillness. People mistake it for passivity, for weakness, for an invitation. What it actually is, when it belongs to the right person, is a form of precision, knowing exactly how much force a situation requires, and applying nothing more and nothing less. He had not raised his voice in that cabin. He had not made a threat or an appeal or a performance of any kind. He had simply stayed where he was, with the facts in front of him, and waited for the truth to do what it always does when you give it enough room. It caught up. It always does. It only ever needs someone willing to stand still long enough to let it.